Hi, everyone. This is Joey Lindstrom over at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. I am going to get us started in just about 1 minute. It looks like I'm having a small issue with sharing my screen. So if you'll give me just a moment, we will get started. Okay, thanks everybody for your patience. We are ready to get started. Apologies for the confusion on the screen display. Today's topic is getting candidates on the record. This is the 7th in our 15-part monthly installment for Our Homes, Our Votes 2020. This is NLIHC's large effort to get more low-income renters and their allies registered to vote and turning out to the polls in November. And we are now going to begin talking about how to engage not just voters, but also candidates for office. So for today's webinar, first, please know that we will allow time at a couple of different points for questions. You can enter questions into the questions box in the control panel at the right-hand side of your screen. You can also hit the raise hand icon on your screen, and I can unmute you during the questions portion, and maybe you can ask your question directly. But I think the best method is to use the questions box in your control panel on the right-hand side. We're going to provide access to both a video recording and a copy of today's webinar slides to all participants. So you'll be getting that in a follow-up email tomorrow. And if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please feel free to reach out to Brooke Shipwright at the email address currently on your screen, and she can help you work through any problems you might be having with the audio or with your GoToWebinar display. So today, we're going to chat about several things. One, just an introduction of Our Homes, Our Votes, what it is, what it's about, and why we're doing it. Then we'll discuss the recent topic of the day, I guess if you were putting it mildly, which is the coronavirus or COVID-19 and the different ways that it will impact the elections and some of the things that we're doing to try to mobilize resources for homeless populations and low-income renters. We'll also have a discussion of candidate engagement and staying nonpartisan. And then I'll turn it over to one of our guest presenters to go over questionnaires and fact sheets. We'll talk about candidate forums, town hall meetings. We'll also talk about candidate visits to nonprofit organizations or to nonprofit properties. And then we'll talk about upcoming topics for webinars and podcasts. We're really lucky to have with us today some experienced voices who can talk about what they've done in the recent past as it relates to engaging candidates. Eric Huffnagel is from the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness, and he'll be speaking to candidate surveys. And Joan Service is with Arizona Housing Coalition, and she'll share about their recent mayoral candidate forum and some of the impacts that they saw from that event. So first, their introduction, or just an introduction to Our Homes, Our Votes and why we do it. This is a 3-part process: mobilization, registration, and education. And it's a 3-part process for some obvious reasons. We want low-income people to be registered at large numbers. We want them to mobilize and get out to the polls. But we want voters to be educated, and we want candidates to be educated. And it's that third point we're talking about today. You can see on this graph really clearly why we do it. I showed this graph at the beginning of every webinar that we do because I think it's very telling, because it shows a consistent and fairly significant disparity between voter participation between renters and homeowners. And you can see that that disparity is even greater when we look at lower income people versus higher income people. We know through recent polling that 83% of the public want to see candidates who will pay attention to the cost of housing, and we'll talk about more affordable housing. 76% say they're more likely to vote for candidates who espouse solutions. And that's what brings us to today. How are we talking to candidates, and how are we getting them to say how they feel about affordable housing solutions? For us, this has been about the presidential campaign so far and the primaries and getting candidates on the record about housing solutions and ending homelessness. For many of you, it might have a more local focus. It might be about state senators and state representatives. It might be about the city council or the mayor's race. We certainly hope you'll be raising it with your congressional elections for both the House and the Senate in the upcoming November election. But before we get to that, there's something that's been in the news that I think we need to address, and that I think involves a really important call to action for many of you who are with us today. I won't dwell on coronavirus because ultimately we all still have additional work to do in each of our fields, and some of you may have already gotten this information on Monday's webinar. But just as a recap, we do have a very important call to action related to the federal response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The issue is that additional resources are needed to mitigate harm from the coronavirus pandemic. And when I say additional resources, we're specifically talking about $5 billion in emergency solutions grant funding, or ESG funding, that can be used by homeless service agencies throughout the country for things related to hiring additional staff to keep their shelters open longer. Many shelters close during the day, and people who are homeless have nowhere to go because libraries and other public spaces are closing. It can also help to pay for sprung structures that can be popped up and used to create new and additional shelter capacity. It can be used to get things like hand sanitizer or basic medical resources in the hands of homeless outreach workers who are working with people who are out on the streets. ESG funding is going to be extremely important. We're also tracking and supporting the various cities and states that have moved forward with eviction moratoriums in relation to the coronavirus and making sure that people who are at risk of homelessness because their hours have been cut and they are now receiving less income won't be thrown out on the streets, because again, people who are homeless have limited access to healthcare and are the most vulnerable in this situation. So our message to Congress is really simple. Any comprehensive response should include resources to ensure housing stability for low-income individuals and people experiencing homelessness. Unfortunately, the coronavirus response bill that passed yesterday through the Senate did not include any new funding for homeless services or for affordable housing programs, and it did nothing to provide housing stability. We are being told that there will be a forthcoming, much larger economic stimulus package, and that there is a significant opportunity for us to have housing and homelessness addressed in part in that bill, and we're hoping that it's addressed very significantly. So please see the link at the bottom of this page and visit our website for more updates about coronavirus and what's being done on housing and homelessness and how you can be involved. Please talk to your members of Congress today and let them know that low-income communities and people who are homeless are the most vulnerable among us during this crisis, and their needs should be prioritized. Coronavirus and the elections. This is, of course, an Our Homes, Our Votes 2020 webinar, so I would be remiss if I didn't focus for a moment about how coronavirus is impacting the elections. The presidential primaries, many of you have seen, are being rescheduled or canceled in many states. In some states, this is considerable because it's not just a presidential primary. It might also be a primary for local elections and so forth. So I think the best thing to do is to find out the new dates for your state by going to your respective Secretary of State's website or if you go to nonprofitvote.org and look at voting in your state, some of that information is going to be updated, or there will be links to the Secretary of State's office as necessary. There are some important strategies to keep in mind as we think about coronavirus and the election. Number one is we should all be very aggressively, very deliberately promoting vote by mail in the communities that we work with. If you're a property manager, or if you're a leader of a residents association, or if you work at a neighborhood center, we should be doing everything we can to make sure people have an opportunity to vote by mail or to do no excuse absentee voting. That's kind of a technical difference, but really get themselves a ballot so that they can vote without going to a polling location. Frankly, for low-income communities, this has always been a really good practice because many of the populations that we work with are elderly or people with disabilities who sometimes have mobility issues. And encouraging vote by mail is really important right now. The American Civil Liberties Union has a really great resource on their website right now where they break down vote by mail opportunities in 21 states that have remaining primaries for the presidential election. And we're going to do our best to get some of that information updated on ourhomes-ourvotes.org as well. In addition to promoting vote by mail, I think it's really important that we now start thinking about voter education events, candidate forums, and town halls as remote events when it's possible. When it's possible to do things through the webinar platform like we're using now, or Zoom meetings, or perhaps things that involve Skype. I think that might be an important thing to explore as we think about public events where we're trying to gather people. I think most people are of the opinion that the current guidance on avoiding crowds of more than 10 people is temporary, but we don't know how long that guidance will remain in place. And so it's difficult for all of us to plan events, even in the near future, where we're encouraging people to attend and to gather, because again, there's so much guidance that prevents that. So I will say that for the rest of this webinar, much of what we will discuss will be focused on candidate forums and town halls and other events. As you consider planning one in your community, consider either a remote event or scheduling it for the end of summer or early autumn. With that, I will say the next thing to know is making voters aware of online voter registration tools so that they can be registered to vote, knowing that there's going to be a reduced effort to get door-to-door volunteers to register voters face-to-face. There are going to be fewer voter registration tables at public spaces and public events because indeed there will be, for the next few months, fewer public spaces and fewer public events. And so using email lists, using social media, using newsletters to make sure that residents or low-income renters who work or live in our communities are aware of their opportunities to vote or to register to vote online. So that's the coronavirus topic that I wanted everybody to be aware of. I want to now explore nonpartisan candidate engagement and what that means for 501c3 organizations. So if you're a 501c3, it's very important to remember that you can, in fact, register voters, educate voters, you can get voters to the polls, you can, in addition, engage candidates on the issues, which is what we're doing here today. And so I would like to also share that you can do all of these things as long as you are doing so in a nonpartisan manner that doesn't constitute any endorsement of any candidate and doesn't coordinate with any particular political party. Your staff who are involved can, in any campaign, can do so, but they must do so on their personal time and can never do it on company time at all. So that is the first thing to keep in mind. There are additional restrictions for certain kinds of nonprofits. Some groups that receive community services block grant funding or AmeriCorps Vista or Head Start funding might have additional restrictions, but those restrictions are usually minor. In the case of Head Start or CSBG, the restrictions are you can still do nonpartisan voter engagement, you just can't use that pot of money. The only group with really stringent bans on participating are legal services groups. So staying nonpartisan and engaging candidates is not that tricky. You just have to make sure that you're being considerate in how you describe candidates and their statements. You always want to avoid criticizing candidates on a given issue. So, for example, we're now at a point where the presidential primaries are nearly over. And it looks like Joe Biden will emerge as the Democratic candidate for president. And I can tell you, without exhibiting any bias for or against him, that of all the presidential candidates in the Democratic primary, he was the last to release a plan on affordable housing. And while I wouldn't criticize it or compare it to the other plans, I can tell you what was in that plan and what might be some things that we would have liked to see in that plan. I would do so in a way that doesn't compare it to other candidates' plans. It's always appropriate to add perspective. If a candidate is proposing a solution that your organization knows won't work, you can add your perspective, but you don't necessarily want to say that that makes the solution that's proposed by the candidate good or bad. You would simply be adding your perspective. You can more directly correct the record when a matter of fact is being used and is being used incorrectly, right? So if a candidate went out and said, 0% of renters in my district are cost burdened, you could correct that record and give the actual number. And in any given community, which is going to be somewhere between 30 and 50% of renters being cost burdened. And you are always should feel comfortable correcting the record if it's a point of fact and not opinion or perspective. You'll always want to avoid ranking or rating candidates, as I was mentioning earlier. As NLIHC has done at ourhomes-ourvotes.org, we have all the information about the presidential candidates and what they said on affordable housing, but at no point did we rank any of the candidates as better or worse. Doing so would constitute an endorsement, and that would be a violation of 501c3 status. Legislative scorecards are something that you'll see certain organizations do. This gets into some trickiness and some gray areas as it relates to nonprofit organizations. Generally, legislative scorecards would only ever be for incumbent legislators because you would be ranking them not as candidates, but as elected officials. And even when doing that, there are important guidelines on how to do so in a way that doesn't constitute any endorsements, which it specifically, you have to make them aware from the very beginning of the legislative session that they will be graded on certain criteria. So this is different from a voter guide. A voter guide most often will include information about what a candidate has said or who the candidates are and what their track record is. For nonpartisan candidate elections, many of you might live in communities where the mayor or the city council or the county board are not partisan races, so they don't have an R or a D or any other party next to their name when people vote. It is, even in these cases, still not okay to endorse a candidate or to coordinate with a campaign, even if it's a nonpartisan election. The only thing on a ballot where a 501c3 organization can have an affirmative and outspoken position is a ballot initiative when that ballot initiative is in fitting with the mission of a given organization. So if there's a ballot initiative on affordable housing or a housing bond or homelessness issues and your organization wants to have a position, that would be fully appropriate. All right. So having talked about some of the legal considerations that are related to engagement with candidates, I'd like to now turn it over to Eric Huffnagel from the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness to share a little bit about candidate questionnaires and some of their recent efforts doing kind of questionnaires with state legislative candidates in Michigan. So, Eric, I am going to unmute you, and you should be able to take it away, sir.
Very good. Thank you, Joey. Appreciate that. Welcome, everyone. It's nice to see such a good turnout here, especially when our bandwidth gets soaked up with the elephant in the room that Joey was talking about. But we just need to remember that we do have things that we need to have continued engagement on, and that's the important thing for us, not to keep our eye or take our eye off the ball as we move forward. So what I want to talk to you about today is an effort that our organization undertook several years ago to try to gauge where prospective legislators and current legislators were with respect to the issue of homelessness. And so we actually moved forward with a legislative candidate survey or questionnaire. Next slide. There we go. So, what is the reason for doing it? And the simple answer is engagement. We want to be able to engage with those individuals who are elected officials, as well as those who are running for office, that are contemplating holding office. Next slide. So the engagement has two separate target audiences, as I said. What we put out was focused on our state House and Senate races, and also the other audience, which was important for us, and it may not be for you if you pursue it, but for us as a statewide organization, we wanted to make sure that we were also communicating with all of the local COCs, and we also refer to them as local planning bodies, those that are larger COCs that may have smaller subsets within them that meet for planning purposes. And so those were the two audiences we thought of and how we could increase engagement with respect to elected officials and the issues relating to homelessness. Next slide. So goals with candidates. First and foremost, we wanted to make sure we were introducing the issue of homelessness as something for them to be aware of. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. So we wanted to make sure that homelessness was something that they had on their radar. Number two, we wanted to find out what they actually knew about the issue. It's one thing to make sure that they knew that we believed that homelessness was an issue, but we wanted to find out where they were coming from on the issue. And so what we were able to gather from them helped to inform the way that we interact with them, and that's what would be of value to you as well. If they're elected, what do you know about them? What are their views on things? What are some of the gaps that they may have? It's very helpful to have some insight about those candidates. Next slide. So another thing with respect to the candidates and the goals of the tool is assessing whether or not they could be a potential ally or an obstacle. So it's not only trying to gauge how they might weigh in on specific legislation or asks, but to find those that have some particular insight and may want to be working with you. And likewise, who are those that may have views that actually are counteractive to what you may be putting forth as your priorities? So knowing those two things help to inform, again, those communications that you have with them and the relationships and what kind of information you share. But certainly developing possible champions is really an important thing to help you carry the water with respect to the issues at the Capitol. Goal number 4 was actually putting our organization's name in front of them. So it's one thing for us to be putting out information about the issues surrounding homelessness, but we wanted them to understand who we were, where we fit into the scheme of things, and for them to think in terms of us being a resource, that we are credible and we have information and we have a grassroots support that would be something that they can also utilize if they want to put something forth. So greasing the wheels for future engagement. Next slide. So goals with the local COCs in our minds was making sure that the community stakeholders know about the candidates who are running for office in the district that include their service area. So quite often we get a little busy and bogged down. We may not be paying attention as much to who those individuals are that are running for office and trying to gather that information. Maybe we only know what's presented by them in different forums and on their website, et cetera, but there may not be any mention about homelessness or related issues. So we wanted to make sure that we could gather that information and put that out to the local COCs. We intentionally then sent information out, the summary of the responses from the um, um, the candidates from their respective districts that aligned with the COC service areas. Next slide. So the other thing is we wanted to use this as a tool to help motivate people at the local level to be reaching out to candidates to engage them as appropriate based on whether or not they might be perceived as an ally or an obstacle. So the idea is if you see somebody who may be a prospective ally, it really would behoove you as local stakeholders to be thinking about how are you going to be reaching out and engaging with them and trying to develop that relationship. But likewise, thinking in terms of what kind of candidates might be obstacles to what you want to be achieving, and so knowing that and how you might communicate in the future is important. So it's education at that district level. You want to make sure that communication then is coming from, as you would say, the grassroots, people on the ground aspect to connect with those individuals. The ground game at the local level really empowers the action at the state level. And I can't emphasize that enough. At the state level, as an organization, there's only so much that we can do to impart information to elected officials. But when they hear it from someone in the district, it really pumps it up a bit. And when they hear it from multiple people, when they hear it from representatives of a stakeholder group, a larger group of people, it really exponentially increases the impact. And so that is the value that we see in getting information at the local level and helping them have the tools to reach out and to try to develop those relationships to make the impact going forward. Next slide. So education at that district level. We sent correspondence introducing the issue and stakeholders on the ground in the district. So we wanted to make sure that connections were being made. And we were asking folks at the local level then to take the information we had provided with respect to the responses to the questionnaires, to then reach out and try to engage with those individuals who were running for office. And we were suggesting things such as inviting them to attend a local COC meeting or other gathering that may be held, or to invite them, to invite candidates to a site visit with a local provider or providers. And as Joey was indicating before, you want to make sure that you're thinking about having not just a single party represented, but making it available, or the invitations being sent out to people across party lines. Next slide, please. So this is really important, remembering the long game. Some of you have been engaged in this process before, some of you have not, but I think it's really important for those who are not as familiar with it to think about how the long game is important, because you establish relationships and you maintain relationships over a period of time. You can't necessarily just introduce yourself to somebody, think you can flip a switch, and that you have a payoff on it. You are starting to develop relationships just by this type of engagement, knowing a little bit more about who those candidates are and elected officials are. And so it's important not only if they get elected, but likewise, these are relationships that may benefit you down the road. If they don't win the election, that candidate may be somebody who actually continues to be involved in politics, maybe running for something else in the future, or they may actually be people who are wanting to be more engaged in the community and may end up being an ally in different capacities. So it's always good to build those relationships and think about how they may pay off down the road, not necessarily just an immediate outcome on it. So engage with people of influence, in essence, that may be able to help you out today or in the future. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit at this point and talk a little bit about some best practices that have been put together. It's not completely comprehensive, but we just want to stimulate your thinking about it. So questionnaires really serve two purposes, and one is to collect information about the candidate's views for voters to have, and also for you as stakeholders to understand where they're coming from. but it's also the opportunity to inform candidates about the range of issues that are important to your organization. So as you're putting together your questionnaires, you want to be strategic, not only because you want to necessarily see what a candidate may understand about particular issues, but you also have that opportunity to put certain things out in front of them that they may not have thought about before. So you're in a position where you can introduce something to them that may be a foreign concept. And I say that because there are candidates that I'm aware of who end up trying to do some research when they see about a program or some other um, survey reference that they will want to know more about it, and you can tell from their answer that they actually have done some research to figure out what that is. So again, that's kind of putting something on their radar screen as well. Now, the questionnaire should be publicly posted and shared once completed. So, what's the point of just having it and keeping that information internally? You want to make sure that that information is put out in a way that makes a lot of sense. So, developing a plan for how to get those answers out is important. Again, as I said, through our organization, we wanted to get that information out in a concerted effort through local COCs, but we did make them available on our website as well. So you have to think strategically about where you want that information to go and how that would be used. Provide clear instructions. I can't see the whole slide there, but think in terms of brevity. Don't inundate people with a 100-question questionnaire. You want to think in terms of what makes sense. So have multiple people reading the questions that you're developing so that they are clear. They're not going to be left to misinterpretation. If it's not clear, you may get the wrong type of information, wrong answers, or they may just skip over it if they don't know exactly what you're looking for. So be thoughtful about that. And again, I would have multiple eyes taking a look at it, and sometimes you can even get input from other people outside of your organization to try to get non homeless service providers looking at it, maybe asking some questions that you might get from the people that are actually filling out the questionnaire later. So multiple perspectives are helpful. Clear deadlines, making sure that they know when you want it. Don't just leave it open-ended. The most difficult thing will probably be having a deadline and then following up with people so that you can have those gentle nudges to encourage them to complete it, because some will answer it quickly. By and large, most will not. And so it will take some nudging and reminding, but having that deadline is really important. Next slide. Okay, so questionnaire considerations and guidelines. Share it with all the candidates. Don't just be selective and pick some. If you've got multiple candidates for an office, send it out to all of them. Using open-ended questions is really important as well, because you might be surprised at how much information you get when you do that, as opposed to just a yes or no. Ask questions on a range of issues. Don't be too narrowly focused. Do not ask for pledges of support or compare candidates' responses to the organization's views. So again, you want to hear what they have to say, and you want it unfiltered. You don't want them to answer in the way that they think they need to answer it, and you don't want to also make them think that you're going to be supportive of them if they have a particular position on something. You don't want to have a quid pro quo appearance. Give the candidates a reasonable amount of time to respond. As I said, the deadline is really important. You don't want to make it 3-day turnaround time, but you also don't want to leave a 3-month window. Make sure your survey is brief and ensure a good response rate, which I referenced earlier. And don't modify the candidate responses. Take what you get. That's the raw information, and just put it out the way that they had submitted it. You could be in all kinds of hot water if you do any modification, even if you think that it's appropriate to do that because you think that there was something incorrect or a misspelling, etc. I think you need to take that raw information and just put it out the way that it was presented to you, such as it is. Is there another slide there? Okay, what happens if they don't respond? I talked about this before. Completely acceptable if they don't respond, and you can indicate that. And I think there's a power in that. That holds them accountable. If they don't respond, you want to know that the candidate did not feel it was important enough or did not make the time to actually participate in it. That's not judging them. That's just simply stating the fact that they did not respond. remind the candidates, ahead of the deadline, and to help nudge them. One of the things you can do is to use a little leverage by saying, if we don't hear from you, please be advised that we will indicate that you did not respond. Sometimes a candidate will say, "Oh, if you're going to say that, then gosh, I better do something about that," and they'll fill that out. If you decide to print campaign contact information, only use that which is factual and can be found on other websites. So just be very careful about what information you put out there, and I would say try to restrict it as much as you can to reduce that potential for error. Let's see, is there another slide past that, or we?
No, Eric, I think I'm going to take it over from here and talk about candidate fact sheets.
That would be awesome. You do that, Joey.
All right, so I will mute you again until we get to question and answer in a little bit. And I'll remind folks at this point, Eric just shared a lot of really great information. If you have questions about his experiences in Michigan or about questionnaires more broadly, feel free to put them in the questions box. One of the only things that we've gotten in the questions box so far has been people pointing out that there is some background noise, some sort of typing and so forth. As near as I can figure out, everybody on this webinar is muted, but somehow that must not be true. So if anyone sees on their control panel that they seem to not be muted, go ahead and mute yourself. So we might just be having a small breakdown in the technology there. So continue to put questions in the questions box as we go along. But one thing that I really want to share as follow-up on questionnaires is the idea of candidate fact sheets. And these would be fact sheets that you would give to candidates, right? I don't know how many of you on this call have ever run for office or if you've ever worked on a campaign, but the truth is every candidate for public office is usually an expert on a couple of things, but not an expert on everything, right? Any given candidate might know education really well or the environment really well. We might even have some candidates sometimes who know housing really well. But I think you'll find most candidates are somewhat new to housing and homelessness, or maybe they only know the basics. It is very appropriate for you in your role as a nonprofit leader in your community to say, reach out to campaigns and say, thank you for running for public office. Your commitment to public service is valuable, and we appreciate you being in this race. Rental housing and homelessness is likely to be discussed in the upcoming debate for this seat. And when you discuss this issue, we hope you'll have your facts straight, right? And then you can share completely innocuous facts that are publicly available to everyone. But the truth is, very often, candidates can lock themselves into bad ideas or stereotypes of people who are homeless or things that sound like good solutions but maybe aren't that thought out. And they'll lock themselves into those places because they say, they talk about the issue without really understanding it. So your role in this moment is to educate candidates about, here's how many people are homeless in our community. Here are the primary issues they face. Here's the shortage of affordable and available homes for extremely low-income people. You can find a lot of this information through NLIHC's housing profiles on our website or through the National Housing Preservation Database. Center on Budget and Policy Priorities has some really good information on national and state housing fact sheets, and HUD has some good information on affordable housing on their site as well. But beyond just giving candidates simple information, you can also propose solutions. The information that I just mentioned is something that's very appropriate to share in a candidate questionnaire when you send those out to candidates. What I'm going to mention now is something that you might want to share with campaigns separate from the questionnaire. Because, of course, we mentioned just a little bit ago, Eric was talking about you don't want to compare their answers to your positions. But that doesn't mean they can't know your positions. And indeed, informing candidates of what your positions are helps them have a better understanding of what good solutions might be. So we have an example of this on the Our Homes, Our Votes 2020 website. I've got the URL for it right there. And I've got an image of a 2-page document. You can see it on your screen here that we sent to every presidential campaign. It gives some background on solutions to the affordable housing crisis, and then it has policy recommendations to all presidential candidates. And I really want to emphasize all presidential candidates. You protect your 501c3 status when you share this with every candidate, regardless of how legitimate they might seem. And this is something you can do for mayoral elections or gubernatorial elections or state senate or state house elections. Candidate fact sheets can be really powerful, and it can allow candidates in a given race to begin their discussion of this issue from a place of better knowledge and information. So please inform the debate. If you'd like any help putting together candidate fact sheets, please reach out to myself or anyone on NLIHC's field team, and we can help put together some facts that you might share to candidates in an upcoming election. All right, and with that, I would like to talk a little bit more about candidate forums and town halls. We'll see how many of those there are going to be for the upcoming elections with, the crowd avoidance guidance being in place. We'll see how long that lasts. But for now, let's talk about candidate forums as though we're going to be putting them on all throughout the country, because indeed it is a very powerful tool to get candidates on the record on issues and to get candidates face to face with a crowd of people who we know share our concern for homelessness and affordable housing. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joan Service, who's the Executive Director of Arizona Housing Coalition. Joan, I think you are unmuted if you would like to take it away.
I am, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Assuming yes, just want to say thank you for this opportunity and thank you for being on the call. At the Arizona Housing Coalition, I'd like to share our recent success in hosting a mayoral candidate forum in January of 2019. Now, the advice on the slides are applicable to any community and to any race. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine, Joan.
Fantastic. So the advice, again, is applicable to any community and any race, whether it be at the federal, state, or local level. But as I'm sharing, it'll be the flavor of how we did it in Phoenix. First, I wanted to share with you that it was a collaboration of our organization, the Arizona Housing Coalition, which is a statewide affordable housing and ending homelessness advocacy organization. We were also joined by Vitalist, our social determinants of health think tank and health foundation, and an informal group of concerned advocates working to meet the medical needs of our vulnerable neighbors without homes. And that organization is supported by Dignity Health, a Phoenix area hospital. So with this broad coalition, we were actually able to split the tasks, duties, and costs, each of us providing resources that were within our purview. For example, we at the Housing Coalition orchestrated live Facebook streaming, whereas Vitalist secured the media with their contacts, and Dignity had a relationship with our forum moderator. We did choose to have a forum as we wanted to have a narrow focus on the issue of homelessness, affordable housing, and access to healthcare. We wanted to hear what the mayoral candidates, what their opinions were, what plans that they were wanting to have in place. And we were concerned that with the town hall format, the topics would be too broad and all over the map. As I mentioned, we had a formal moderator independent of our three organizations, so it wasn't any staff members. We were actually lucky to secure a former TV anchor, a gentleman named Frank Camacho, to serve as our moderator. And that would be a suggestion I would have for folks interested in hosting a forum. Secure a seasoned facilitator that can easily pivot and control the conversation based on their own personal community reputation. Thanks for advancing to the next slide, so great. It is important to make sure all three candidates, or all candidates are invited to the forum. At our early planning stages, there were at least 3 candidates running for the Phoenix mayor position, but as it got closer, it was down to just Kate Gallego and Daniel Valenzuela. Had we needed to, we would have looked at polling data to narrow the stage a bit more. I do want to add that if one of the individuals, the candidates, had declined the invitation, the show can still go on, and that's perfectly legal. You just need to make sure that it's clear that having one candidate show up does not signify an endorsement of that candidate. I will also offer a side note that we used nonprofit votes hosting a candidate forum as our playbook. It's available on their website, nonprofitvote.org. Additionally, as I mentioned, our moderator, he came to the gig with the experience of having hosted a candidate forum before, so that was quite helpful. He helped us create ground rules, like, for example, having our female candidate go first with her opening statement as ladies first. Thus, the other candidate was able to close the event. We did give each candidate campaign the opportunity to table outside the event. We knew that they would want that opportunity to solicit volunteers, donations, distribute yard signs and posters, but we made sure that that was all kept outside the event and not brought inside the event. Next slide. As a group, we had, as a group of planners, we had previously come up with the questions that we were going to ask of the candidates. We did share that in advance with the candidates so that they could do their research and have their having had their homework done in advance. I will share that it was clear at the event which candidate had done their homework. But it is important to know in terms of developing those questions, you want to make sure that you narrow the questions to something that their office has the power to control. So in terms of coming up with the questions, the group we were working with were often confused with what questions were within the legislative control versus the city council control. So again, make sure that the questions that are asked are within their roles. In terms of media, like I mentioned, our partners at Vitalist had a public relations team share our press release, and it generated a ton of media showing up. Because we offered both sign language and Spanish translation, we had Spanish-speaking media outlets show up as well, which was great. Both campaigns reported that this event was one of the highest media and turnout exposures of all of their debates and forums to date. And according to our public relations firm that was used, about $240,000 worth of media exposure was generated, just whatever value that means. Next slide. So just in terms of a little bit about what we did for our event, we were, in terms of thinking about the who, what, where, when, and why, we wanted to make sure that the event could accommodate as many folks as we could possibly have. We ended up having it at a City Phoenix hall. It's the City of Phoenix Memorial Steel Indian Park hall, and it had easy parking, easy accessibility. It served as a great location, and it's something to consider. You definitely want to think about your location when in your planning process. Is it a neutral place, and could it be potentially symbolic? We did discuss having it at the Dignity Health's medical amphitheater, because again, the focus was on not just healthcare, or not just housing and homelessness, but also healthcare. Another option would be if there's community space in a housing complex, that could also be another symbolic place to have it. In planning, definitely consider the fact that with most things, whether any event planning, any conference planning, something will go wrong. While we had a seasoned moderator, the sound system took about 5 to 10 minutes to activate at the beginning, and we had not tested that prior. So just anticipate that something is going to go wrong. Ultimately, we had over 250 individuals show up for the event, and they were considerate, and they were busy chatting, so it wasn't that big of a deal. But as planners, we were sweating bullets for a bit. We did employ some cool new tricks for us. We did, like I mentioned, we had Facebook streaming, and then we also employed opportunities for the audience to participate by texting their questions through an app, and we were able to facilitate Q&A questions that way. Lastly, I'll share that there was some partisan politics that occurred after the event. It had nothing to do with us, but that also generated some more press. It had nothing to do with ending homelessness, affordable housing, or healthcare, but further generated media attention to our issues, and then thus what the candidates' viewpoints are on our issues. So with that, I will turn it back over to Joey.
All right, thanks, Joan. That was a really great presentation, and I just kind of want to underscore the power of mayoral candidate forums and candidate forums for members of Congress or people running for state legislature. Sometimes they really appreciate interacting with a large crowd if you're the kind of organization that can build a large crowd. And they really enjoy getting some good photo ops and getting some good quotes in the media if you're the kind of organization that can get the media to attend. This is definitely something that you might want to consider. I'm going to chat just really briefly now about town hall meetings, which are a little bit different than candidate forums. In most cases, a town hall meeting is going to be a very open discussion about many different issues. And very often you'll be engaging in a town hall meeting, in a town hall meeting that you or your organization did not organize, but you're there hoping to ask a question. And if you do so, asking a question can be really powerful. Some key things to have in mind are submit a question in advance. Many town hall meetings will ask people, okay, what would you say if you were called on to ask a question? And indeed, our partners from Polk County Housing Trust Fund, Lauren Johnson, got to ask a question at a Fox News town hall just a couple of months ago because she submitted the question in advance and they followed up with her. A lot of well-organized town halls will do it this way. You also might want to tweet your question before the event, because even if you don't get to the microphone or if you don't get picked to ask a question, candidates might see that you were asking the question, and then you can kind of extend the town hall beyond just the singular event and into the space of social media. If you do show up, pro tip, sit near the microphone. Because when it's time for people to ask questions, what they'll do is they'll say, line up at the microphone, or they'll say, we've got some volunteers in the back with microphones and raise your hand. You'll always be best either sitting near the microphone or sitting near the front where the moderator will be pointing at people to ask questions. When you want to ask a question, when you get an opportunity, to ask a question, try asking a question with two parts. Have a yes or no aspect in the beginning, and then give an opportunity for the candidate to offer additional thoughts. And this means that you can get them to take a position on a given issue and then offer sort of their own sort of thinking and consideration on it. Now, you might be thinking in this moment, hey, Joe, didn't you tell me earlier that I shouldn't be telling them the position I want them to take? And that's true, except in the context of a town hall meeting, you're very rarely going to be representing your organization. You're mostly going to be an individual, and in those cases, you can ask your questions a lot more directly. So these questions can be a great way to get a candidate on the record, and it's an opportunity for them to offer some additional thoughts. You can also include facts in your question to inform the candidate before they get a chance to answer. So here's an example. In our community, more than 1/4 of all renters have an eviction on their record. Do you support a new law guaranteeing the right to an attorney for all renters facing eviction? Also, what would you do to decrease the rapidly increasing evictions in our neighborhoods? Right? So that includes a yes or no, it includes some information, and then it also gives them an opportunity to expand on it. I will, before moving on, just share one example from my own organizing back when I was in Madison, Wisconsin. We did a local campaign to establish a minimum wage of $7.75, and this was at a time when cities that had their own minimum wages was a really rare circumstance. But one thing I got to do was ask a question at a mayoral candidate forum when it was down to just 2 candidates. Would you support a minimum wage for the city of Madison of $7.75 indexed to inflation? And both candidates said yes. And then when we actually moved forward with that campaign after the election, the candidate who ended up winning, I think actually was really nervous about citywide minimum wage, but he knew that he had been on the record and was sort of forced into being supportive because of everybody who had been in that room and heard him make that pledge. So this can be a really effective way to get candidates on board with really important solutions. So the last thing I want to cover before we have a few minutes for questions, and I'll go over this really quickly, is can candidates visit your nonprofit? Can they meet with your residents? Can they show up at a membership meeting? Can they do a tour of your affordable housing? And the answer is yes, but there are some parameters, there are some different ways you want to think about it. First, remember that any public figure has a role as an agent of government, and they are always welcome to be at your events, to provide remarks, and to interact with your network, as long as they're doing so as an office holder and not as a candidate for an office, right? So they can be there and talk about the work that they've done in their role in government, but they can't say things like vote for me on election day and so forth. So a lot of elected officials will be really savvy about this. They'll say, they'll talk about their work as an elected official, and then they'll say, oh, and I was told not to say this next part, and then they just say it, and that kind of protects the nonprofit organization. But generally, they can speak about their legislative achievements. You can also give an award to an elected official. So, for example, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, we give an award every year for leadership that often goes, not always, but often goes to an elected official. When we gave an award to Senator Susan Collins last year, that wasn't an endorsement that people should vote for her. That was a recognition of the work that she had done on housing. If it's related to your work, it's very appropriate. Remember, a candidate can attend if they're invited specifically by you, but you should invite all candidates and not give any indication of support. So, for example, if you wanted candidates for Congress to come and meet with residents of your public housing agency, they can do so, but you should invite all of the candidates, and you can even set it up where certain candidates come on certain days, just as long as all of them are treated equally and they're all invited. Obviously, the candidates cannot raise money at any such event, and usually the best practice is if you're having candidates meet with residents or interact with your members or clients, it's really great to have the residents or the Residents Association lead that event themselves if they have the capacity to do that. And that way it sort of presents as something that the residents are interested in, more so than something that, if you're a housing provider, is something that the landlord is encouraging them to be interested in and so forth. Candidates can also show up at your events. If you're doing a tenants' rights training, or if you're doing a press conference or something, they of course have the right to be there, but you should just ensure that there is no endorsement of any candidate at your event, and that you shouldn't give a candidate any opportunity to step up to the microphone and address your crowd unless it's been made very clear to that candidate that they cannot ask for votes or mention their candidacy. One wrinkle to this that I'll add is if a candidate is a subject matter expert on something you're presenting on, and they also happen to be a candidate for office, then it's totally fine to include them, right? So if you would imagine that Joan Service was running for governor of Arizona, which is a candidacy that I think we would all be very excited about, it would still be appropriate that she was on today's webinar because she has some subject matter expertise to share about this topic. So that's always very appropriate. If someone's a candidate, that doesn't mean they don't also have the experience and knowledge that positioned them to be running for public office. So those are the final notes on candidate visits. We've got a couple of minutes for questions, and I'm going to throw it over to Tori Beret, who I think has been monitoring the questions box to see if we've got anything that's come in. Tori? Tori, are you muted? Okay. I am not hearing from Tori yet, so I'm going to see. What can you do if a candidate agrees to support your cause in a candidate forum, but after elected refuses to support it? Okay, so this is a great question from Amanda, and Amanda is skipping ahead to our last webinar, the one that we're going to do in November, which is all about holding elected officials accountable after they stop being candidates, right? And there are definitely a lot of different ways to do that. One of the best practices, I would say, especially as it relates to candidate questionnaires, is make sure a large audience of people sees that they took the position that you appreciate, right? So if you have a position and they agreed with it, and you have that in a recording or you have that in a statement, making sure as many people as possible see that on your website, through social media, through your newsletter, is extremely important, because the broader the audience that is expecting something of them, the better your chances of holding that particular candidate accountable. Tori, do we have you unmuted now?
Yeah, can people hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, good. Sorry about that.
Before we move on to our next question, Eric or Joan, do you have anything to add on what to do to make sure a candidate remains true to their spoken commitments?
I would think reminding them is probably helpful.
Oh, that's a great point. I think after a candidate is elected, it's very important during the transition to send them a note saying, these were the candidate questionnaire responses we got from you while you were running, and we eagerly look forward to your leadership. I also think after a candidate is elected, it's really important to set up a meeting with them as early as possible to set the tone of what your expectations will be for them moving forward.
Yeah, the more touches you have, the more you can reinforce that relationship.
Tori, what other questions do we have?
Yeah, I have a question about whether you're able to get funding from foundations or other folks for candidate forums.
So this is Joan. We worked with our foundation, Vitalist, and they actually dedicated some of their own resources, both in kind and collaboratively, to host our candidate forum. So I can speak from that vein, and I will share that, you know, I'm seeing more and more foundations really understanding the role of advocacy and funding advocacy.
Great, thanks, Joan. I also just have a comment on here that it's important to inform candidates about the issues that clients of a nonprofit have, as well as the nonprofit agency as a whole.
Yeah, that's definitely important to keep in mind. And I think being mindful of the multi-sector nature of our work and the multiple issues that clients and residents are facing is really, really important. Any other questions at this point?
I don't see any others coming in.
Okay, so folks, just a couple more minutes to add questions while I wrap up our presentation. First, I want to make sure that everybody is aware that we have 8 more presentations in our Third Thursdays at 3 series, which means we are halfway done talking about voter engagement. So please see the link at the bottom of the page. That's where you would go to find recordings of our other presentations. And I think you'll really enjoy some of the issues we've already explored, including voter registration, legal considerations for nonprofits, and so forth. Our next webinar will be about educating voters, both on the logistics of voting and on candidate positions, and producing and distributing voter guides. And then in May, we're going to start talking about ballot initiatives and housing issues and how folks can be involved. And you can see the rest of the lineup right there. National Low Income Housing Coalition is a membership organization. Please consider supporting our work by becoming an individual or organizational member. You can do that at nlihc.org/membership, and we hope you will join today. This is the email address and Twitter handle for the 3 presenters today. We hope that you will keep in touch and send along any questions you might have about the presentation, unless Have any of you entered additional questions into the questions box? Tori?
Yeah, yes, we do. We have one question. Is it okay to highlight candidates that support your position, or should you highlight all candidates and where they stand on your position?
Yeah, so if there's a position that your organization holds and a candidate takes agreement with that position, it's not unnatural for you to express excitement that the solution that you believe in is being discussed, right? And so, again, to me, I think the key thing is to not compare that candidate to another candidate, right? So if you said, we're so thrilled that Bernie Sanders and Julian Castro are talking about a housing entitlement, that's appropriate if a housing entitlement is something that's a high priority for you. If you said, by contrast, we're thrilled that Bernie Sanders and Julian Castro are talking about a housing entitlement, but where is Kamala Harris and Joe Biden on this issue? Well, that would be inappropriate because you'd be comparing the candidates to one another. That sort of thing, I think you probably want to exercise some caution, but I think you definitely can make all the candidates' positions available on your website, and consider if there are things you're excited about, the best way to share them on social media.
Great, thanks, Joey. That looks like that's it for questions.
All right, well, this has been wonderful. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Joan, for being with us today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next month.